Cardiac output, we talked about this a little bit last week. Cardiac output is dependent upon three things. And remember, cardiac output is a total amount of blood that is being circulated by the heart in 1 minute. So it is dependent upon three things, and that is preload, cardiac contractility, and afterload. So preload is the amount of blood essentially returning to the heart, or the filling pressure that the right ventricle goes against. Cardiac contractility is how hard is the heart actually squeezing, how hard is the heart actually contracting. And afterload is the amount of pressure that the left ventricle must pump against in order to get blood out to the body. So generally we think of afterload as blood pressure. So, or systemic vascular resistance, with that term's getting ready to come up on the next slide. So it makes sense that those three things are really what cardiac output depends on. If we jump back to preload, if I don't have a good enough volume of blood returning to the heart, well, then I'm already starting behind the 8 ball. I already don't have enough blood to go round and round. Cardiac contractility, if my heart's not doing a real good job squeezing and pumping out that blood and moving the blood around in all 4 chambers and through all the different vessels, then of course my cardiac output is going to be down. And then finally, afterload. If my blood pressure is really, really high and my left ventricle has to pump really, really hard in an effort to overcome that blood pressure or overcome that afterload, again, my stroke volume isn't necessarily going to be what it should be. It's not going to be adequate. And therefore, my cardiac output is also not going to be adequate. So if you remember, the formula for that cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. Now, pre-hospitally, we don't have a good way of measuring stroke volume. We would have to be given the stroke volume in a test question in order for us to calculate the cardiac output. But what we do know is what a normal stroke volume range is, and that's 60 to 100 or 70 to 100, depending on what textbook you look at. So let's just say the average stroke volume is 70 milliliters. So with each contraction, my left ventricle is ejecting about 70 milliliters of blood to the aorta to go round and round. Now, the heart rate, we can measure that in the field, fortunately, and we can measure that through a variety of different mechanisms. But let's say normal heart rate is 60 to 100. Let's just call it 70 for easy math. So now if I have a heart rate of 70 beats per minute and a stroke volume of 70 milliliters, my cardiac output for that patient would be 4,900 milliliters or 4.9 liters. And remember, that means how much blood is actually going round and round in 1 minute of time from cardiac cycles. So what causes shock? By definition, shock is inadequate tissue perfusion, right? And if you think about it a little bit in more detail, every organ is made up of tissues. So if my organs aren't getting enough oxygenated blood because they are being inadequately perfused, those organs are eventually going to become sick, they're going to become injured, and they're going to become necrotic or dead. So, which is the end stage of shock. So we see low blood pressure in shock, and that's really the first thing that we think of when we hear of shock, right? This patient's in shock, that patient's in shock. Oh my gosh, they're going into shock. We always think about blood pressure first. So that low blood pressure can really be driven by 2 different things. It can be a cardiac output problem, or it can be a decrease in systemic vascular resistance. Okay, so all shocks that we're going to talk about, you can really classify them as, is this a cardiac output problem, or is this a decrease in systemic vascular resistance problem? And I'll explain that a little bit more once we get into the actual shocks. But when we have hypotension, it's either because I don't have enough blood going round and round, or it's because my vessels don't have enough resistance in them. They're too dilated to really maintain a good blood pressure and in order to adequately perfuse tissues downstream.